Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane, brought to you by the Washington Speakers Bureau. In this space, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges that leaders face today with the world's most respected, innovative, curious, and accomplished thought leaders. We'd like to welcome our host, best-selling author and co-author of the recently published book, Choose Love, Not Fear, a WSB exclusive speaker for almost 30 years, Gary Heil.
Hello and welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fast Lane. My name is Gary Heil. Today's guest is Ian Bremmer, best-selling author, Columbia professor, founder of the Eurasia Group, founder and president of GZERO Media. Ian's the guy the Wall Street Journal calls the guru of political risk analysis, and that he created the first political risk index for Wall Street and has been instrumental in making political risk an academic discipline. Good morning, Ian.
Good to be with you, Gary.
Good to be with you. As we begin today, it seems that the rate of growth of this virus may have flattened some areas of the world, but it's still raising havoc on the world. 6 million cases, 213 countries affected. You know, it seems like we have a global problem, but I'm not sure that we have the global leadership or global resolve to address that problem effectively. Where, if anywhere, are we going to find the leadership to address this thing effectively?
Well, I mean, certainly we are addressing it in different ways. And, just looking at how the different waves of the virus have played out across the world shows that. I mean, the first wave was in China. That's where this virus came from. And it exploded like wildfire. And then they hammered it down. And they did it in a unique way because they have the ability to ensure both full quarantine with 100% compliance. It is not up to the people. And also surveillance, which is very intrusive and technologically fully engaged. And so what you had in China was a peak. It's like Mount Fuji. You go up, you go down. And I'm not saying that because I trust China's data. I'm saying it because you look at the satellite imagery, you look at the traffic patterns, you look at what the companies are doing. We have access to that information, and you can see right now, talking to you, that China's supply chain is back up and running when the US and Europe still is not. So there you got that model. And has China had leadership domestically after the initial cover-up? And the answer is yeah. Then you look at the United States and Europe, and we had the same explosion later than China, came from China first to Europe, then the United States. We both explode. We're about 10 days behind the Europeans. And the front end of the peak looks the same. But then getting it done with is a very different story. It doesn't look like Mount Fuji. It looks like a tsunami where the water stays very high for a long time and you have additional waves. And so 3 months later, 6 months later, you're still going to see cases. Because, we do a lockdown. It's not like a Chinese lockdown, right? We tell people we want you to stay in your houses, and some of them do, and some of them don't, and some of them go to beaches, and some of them socially distance, and some of them wear masks. So it's a lot more challenging. And we wouldn't want a system like that, but we also don't have a system like that. And so the implications for our economy restarting clearly going to be a lot more challenging, going to take a lot longer time. And now, finally, as you say, Gary, the United States and in Europe, we're seeing our case numbers aren't at the same level. Thankfully, my own New York City is no longer the global epicenter, and our ICUs are not overwhelmed. We were able to ensure we had beds for people that need them. And that's now true in other parts of the country, too, even though some states you do see cases expanding from a much lower level. But the epicenter now is in the developing world, a lot poorer. They don't have the test capabilities. They don't have the healthcare capacity. And they certainly don't have the economic capability to respond to the crisis as it plays out. So whether you're talking about Brazil or Russia or India, I mean, here, first of all, we won't know how many cases there are because they'll never do the kind of testing that we've had in the United States or Germany or South Korea or Japan. And you won't know how many people are dying from it for the same reason. We won't have the kind of data collection, and there'll be a lot of comorbidities that they won't say come from coronavirus, and they don't have the economic capacity to provide the relief for the people, so they can't do the lockdowns for as long. Now, the reason that's a problem is because our global economy is interconnected. And so if you want to restart the global economy, but you're getting goods and services provided from all over the world, and you travel all over the world, and in fact, you even get some of your labor coming over to our countries from South America, Southeast Asia, and then they send that money back to their own families to give them a shot to have the kind of middle class standards that they all aspire to. Well, that's going to take so long to get back in place. So, I mean, you and I, Gary, we can go around the world and we can talk about the fact that there's been very strong leadership from places like South Korea and Germany and smaller countries like New Zealand. We can say the US didn't do as good of a job in terms of our testing, but we did a very good job with the Fed and the initial fiscal response. But the fact is that the world isn't rowing together. The crisis is affecting us in different times, in different ways, and the leadership isn't aligned, and it's very mixed. So here we are, the worst crisis of our lifetimes, and the response is not what you'd like it to be. And of course, that means you have to think about the impact of that on what the global economy is going to look like in 1 and 2 and 3 years' time.
Yeah. Any chance the WHO will take a better leadership role or a bigger role in helping to solve this problem internationally?
You know, I think the answer to that, at least for the foreseeable future, and I fully understand that foreseeable is a little more narrow today than it used to be, is no. The World Health Organization is, in best of times, a weak organization, and we want it that way. Now, there's been a lot of focus in the last weeks about how the World Health Organization took Chinese data in early January at face value and promoted it as if that was really what was going on, when there was actually human-to-human transmission in China, and the Chinese were traveling around China and to our own countries as if there was no problem. And that got the pandemic. So the World Health Organization, you know, was too weak to call BS on the Chinese government. And that's a problem. And that's one of the reasons that we now are saying we don't support the WHO. But the WHO also was too weak to call out the Americans for not having a test kit that worked. And we were using it. We knew it wasn't effective. And there were WHO test kits that were available, like from Germany. And the World Health Organization could have done a real service to American citizens by coming out publicly and saying, your government isn't getting it done, and what you need is this test kit, and we can help you with that. They never did that. And you know why? Well, because we're the biggest donors to the WHO, and their leadership is never going to take that kind of an action against either us or any other donor, China, the Europeans, and the like. So what we're stuck with is a weak bureaucracy. They're better than nothing. And certainly their scientists, their doctors are good. They're also skittish because, you know, they raised the alarm really strongly after SARS, for example, H1N1, and it turned out to be not such a massive global catastrophe. And so a lot of people looked at the WHO and they said, come on, Chicken Little, you know, the sky is falling. And so they were also, on top of not having a lot of influence, they were also skittish over that. But I do have to tell you, and look, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, I just call them as I see them, but the idea that the Trump administration would threaten to leave the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic, when that's all we have, I mean, that's just really an abdication of leadership. And I do blame the Chinese for covering up. I do think that there needs to be an investigation. I do think that it's unacceptable that they didn't tell their own people or the rest of us that they knew that there was a whistleblower who they actually forced to sign, you know, a fake recusal, you know, that he didn't really mean it. And no, he was making this stuff up, and he was, you know, threatening public security by raising this alarm. And, you know, if the Chinese government hadn't covered that up, how many lives would have been saved, how many trillions of dollars wouldn't have been spent. So absolutely, I blame the Chinese for that. But we are responsible for the World Health Organization, just like anyone else. And these are bureaucrats that are under massive constraints with limited resources, trying to do impossible jobs in the best of times. This is now the worst of times, and we are going after first responders. And I find that unacceptable.
Yeah, this week, Ian, there's been a lot of news about cyber spying, state-sponsored cyber spying, especially as to COVID medical information. You coined the term, I believe, vaccine nationalism. Is this the kind of actions that you were thinking of when you talked about vaccine nationalism?
Both sides. There is offensive cyber activity that we know about on the part of the Chinese government and the Iranian government, and I'm sure other actors as well, to try to gain information, proprietary information, that would give them an advantage in the creation of a vaccine. The Chinese are putting a lot of money into vaccines that are competing with those of the US, those of the Europeans, those of the WHO. And there are about 110 vaccines right now at various stages of development. I promise you, whoever comes up with the first vaccines that work, you're going to put an enormous amount of money into manufacturing that vaccine as fast as possible. Just now, the United States has a company that has bought a Czech company that owns in India the largest industrial vaccine producer in the world, and they would be able to produce 1 billion doses of vaccine with their present capabilities by the end of 2021, assuming it works. This vaccine we're talking about, you need 2 doses, that's 1 billion doses, 500 million people. We know how many people there are in the world. There's not 500 million people. There's over 7 billion people. So who's going to get that vaccine first? Well, if the Americans develop it, it's going to be the Americans and some of our allies and some people that can pay for it. What happens if the Chinese vaccine comes first? It's going to be the Chinese, and they're actually in partnership with the Canadians. And how much pressure are we going to put on Canada as a consequence of that? I mean, you're talking about the ability to fight this disease and therefore get your economy fully functioning, new normal. I mean, the vaccine is the switch. Right now, we have the ability to nudge people, prod people, tell them they can be safer if they do X, Y, and Z. That's not an on and off switch. That is a very difficult process of pushing people through molasses to try to get our economies back functioning again. A vaccine that works distributed across your population, that's a switch. You can go back to the way the economy is supposed to run, but not everybody gets it at the same time. So vaccine nationalism, both because we're not cooperating in the investigation and testing of these vaccines, we won't be cooperating in the investing and in the production of vaccines, and we're certainly not cooperating in the cyber attacks to gain intellectual property theft of these vaccines. This is not a good environment for international cooperation, the worst crisis of our lifetime.
Calling out again for global leadership that doesn't exist.
I mean, it's not that I'm calling for it. I'm saying that we have to understand that this is no longer a US-led global order. The US is the world's most powerful superpower. We have the world's largest military by a long margin. We're the largest energy producer, food producer, and we export food. We have the world's global reserve currency, but our ability to and desire to lead the world, either economically or militarily or politically or through architecture and institutions, just is not there. And so therefore, you don't have that global leadership, radically different than what we experienced after 9/11, radically different than what we experienced after 2008, 2009. And when we think about what the world is going to look like as we get through and come out of this coronavirus pandemic, it needs to reflect that we don't have that global leadership. And so, I mean, people can call for it however they want. but I mean, my business is to try to help explain, the politics of the now, not the idealism of the not about to be.
Are we experiencing the first depression of our lifetime for those of us who weren't alive in the late 1920s?
So, I want, my answer to that is yes, but there's a big caveat. So we know in 2008, 2009, we described that as the Great Recession. The Great Recession implying that it was the granddaddy of all recessions. And it was indeed the biggest economic knock to the global economy since the Great Depression. So that implies to me, because there's no technical definition for a depression. There is for a recession. It's, in an advanced industrial economy, it's 2 quarters, one after the other, of negative growth. For the world economy, it's sub 2% growth for the year. That's how we define it. So we know, because they happen on average since World War II, we've experienced recessions on average every 7 years. We kind of know what a recession is. The way we describe a global depression is that it is larger than a recession in scope, in depth, and duration. Now, if 2008, 2009 was the greatest recession, then it stands to reason anything bigger than that is a depression. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that when we look at how global this is, how long it will take for us to get back to 2020 pre-coronavirus levels, the implications of shutting down the entire supply chain and consumer demand, the inability to get back to normal until you have a vaccine, the persistent double-digit employment, 25% at its worst, we hope, in the United States, but persistent double-digit employment for a long time, the disruption that comes from tech firms doing so well and bricks and mortar getting destroyed. I mean, all of that makes it fairly abundantly clear that you would describe this as a depression. But I think a lot of people don't want to do that, in part because they don't want to panic people. They understand the only depression we've had in modern memory was the Great Depression, and they don't want people to think that we're going back to, people selling apple cores on the side of the street. And I think an important thing to recognize is not only is it not likely to be that bad objectively, but also there is so much more wealth in society today than there was during the Great Depression. I mean, not only in our own country here in the United States, but if you look at the developing world, the average middle class citizen in Brazil or Mexico or Turkey today is objectively wealthier and has access to better health care and better education than the average member of the middle class in the United States during the Great Depression. So there's just so much more wealth in human capital. So our ability to respond to a commensurate economic shock 100 years later, 90 years later, is a lot greater than it was before during the Great Depression. So I think, it's not one of these things that you can just say depression and then use it as a headline. That's going to panic people. But if we have a conversation like this where we can actually describe and discuss it, yeah, I think people should understand what we're looking at.
And that argues then that we're not going to come out of it quickly. It's going to be a more drawn out recovery, you think?
Yeah, I mean, the markets can respond quickly, and we're seeing that. Certainly, no matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, everyone I know tells me Jay Powell is doing a fantastic job. I mean, I've spoken to Jack Lew about this. I've spoken to Jason Furman about this, Larry Summers about this. These are not Trump fans. They have all told me that Powell is doing a fantastic job, that there is nothing that they can criticize him on. That was a Trump appointee. So, and not only that, there's not a lot of coordination between the central bank governors around the world, but they all went to the same schools. They all remember the playbook from 2008, 2009. They kind of understand how to respond to a major global crisis, and they're doing it. So even though they're not coordinating, they are all rolling in the same direction. That is helping the markets in this environment. And also, I mean, even though we in the United States, we had a president that was cheerleading inappropriately, in my view, as this crisis started, and certainly didn't get testing done and didn't take enough leadership vis-a-vis the governors and the mayors, wasn't coordinating well, was more divisive. But the economic response, led by Mnuchin on the phone with Pelosi, that's bipartisan, in a very short period of time, $3+ trillion hitting every part of the economy. Got to tell you, pretty robust, more effective than most advanced industrial economies around the world. So all of that is part of the reason why I think the markets in the United States and the West have been comparatively robust. But that is very different, Gary, from saying that in a year or 2 years, that the average member of the middle or working class whose lives have been turned upside down, who don't have the savings, who don't have the guaranteed jobs, who are much more vulnerable to the virus than those of us that can sit safely in our offices as part of the knowledge economy and continue the work the way we had before. I think that their lives are going to be affected much more dramatically. The idea to me that restaurants or bars or non-essential air travel, sporting events, tourism, hotels, hospitality, we can go on and on. It's not like these companies were minting money. The profitability models for these companies were competitive and were stressed. And now you're going to have not only the economic hit of the past months, but the fact that they're not coming back anywhere close to fully functional for years. So how many small and medium businesses just can't operate profitably for years as a consequence of that? How many major companies experience bankruptcy? And as all of those CEOs, every one of them, and I talked to a lot of them, are telling me that if they need to, they can make more money with fewer people. They weren't making those calculations 5 years ago because the markets were doing well. Why would you want to fire people if you don't have to, if your shareholders are happy? But now that you're facing a more challenging supply chain, just in case, it needs to be more resilient, it's more expensive, you're watching every dollar. Some of your clients and partners have gone to hell, they're not paying their bills. You got to fire people. And so what's going to happen, and the technology companies that don't have as many full-time employees, though they have a lot of gig economy types, they don't need as many people as the bricks and mortar companies, the digital economy as opposed to the real economy. And those are the companies doing so well. So what I'm saying is the ability to respond is not 6 months, 12 months. It's until you have that vaccine. And on top of that, you've got the fighting, the political fighting that makes it worse. You have the Americans versus the Chinese on technology and on trade. You've got the Americans versus the Saudis and the Russians on energy. You have the Americans versus everybody on the vaccine. This is a time when you're going to see a lot more nationalism. And our taxpayers are being told that they've got to bail out these big companies. They're going to put conditions on that bailout to say, you better invest that capital back in America. You better employ Americans, even though if we're more expensive, it's tough. Because, I mean, you look at our double-digit unemployment, not just the American taxpayers saying that. What about the Germans? What about the Indians? What about the Brazilians? So we're going to see an unwind of globalization, which on the one hand was the most efficient, most growth productive system you could have for the global economy, but which created a lot of inequality in our societies. And now we're going to have our citizens demanding that you address that inequality in ways that will hamper the efficient functioning of the global economy. So you can't forget about any of those things as you think about how we're going to restart coming out of this crisis.
You coined the term just in case supply chains. And I'm wondering if you think that's going to be a more permanent decision that companies will make to consider risk in the supply chain going forward.
You know, I don't actually, because a just-in-time supply chain where you're Amazon and you don't need a lot of warehouse space because you've got, not only do you know when an order comes in, you have enough AI and deep learning in your big data that you even can predict when there's going to be a spike in certain types of consumer demand. And you're not even sure why, but it doesn't matter because the algorithm works, right? I mean, spooky logic. So that's really cheap. And now we're in an environment where you're saying you need warehouses and you need better logistics because your supply chain could break. So for a period of time, we're going to put a lot more money into ensuring that our supply chains are resilient because it is a rainy day. Gary, what I'm suggesting is that as we come out of this crisis, the willingness of those CEOs to continue to pay that premium is likely to go down pretty quickly. I mean, I think 1 to 2 years after the vaccine, you'll actually see those supply chains becoming much more just in time again. But I also think that you're going to see political efforts that will make certain sectors national champions. Now, that's not new. I mean, in the Cold War, the military-industrial complex did not have a just-in-time supply chain. If you were Lockheed, you didn't get to make your advanced jet fighters in the Soviet Union, even if they had better and cheaper scientists, right? And you didn't get to sell there either. So we know what industrial policy is like when it involves a sector that involves critical national security. But what's interesting is that national security is now going to be defined more broadly to include the social safety net, to include the social contract. So, I think that pharmaceuticals, the production of pharmaceuticals and the supply chain around personal protective equipment for your medical care is going to become a national champion industry. And you're not going to think it's okay for that to be produced in China, or maybe a lot of it even outside the United States or your home country, but certainly not with countries that you don't consider allies, where you don't have control and they can shut it off. I mean, the fact that we're blaming the Chinese for stocking up on PPE and importing a bunch, getting their hands on more while they were covering it up, whether or not that's true, you can see the direction. And I think that labor, companies that have a lot of labor, are increasingly going to be seen as a strategic sector because you have all of this unemployment. So even though the economic rationale for resilience will go away, the political logic behind having a supply chain that is shorter and more patriotic is going to grow.
I mean, thank God for Amazon. Would you agree in this pandemic? I mean, I don't know what I would do without Amazon. I don't know what I'd do without Zoom and some of the technology companies that seem to be flourishing. But does that make us more at risk for some of the hacking and cyber warfare kinds of practices or disinformation kind of events that we've seen recently?
Obviously, the more the economy is digital, the more vulnerable you are to that shutting down. I accept that. But I think it is interesting to see just how robust all of this has been. The companies that have most at stake and are the largest are the ones that have done the best job in ensuring that kind of resilience to hacking. I mean, hacking happens in all sorts of ways. It doesn't need to be digital. I mean, people can go in and actually directly steal stuff and directly undermine operations. They can blow stuff up, as we know, right? I mean, tanker traffic around the Gulf of Aden. The fact that, so the good news on cyber is that the companies that we're talking about that are most important for keeping the digital economy functioning are massive monopolies with enormous amounts of expertise and money to invest in cybersecurity. And they also are most aware of what those vulnerabilities are. So I'm a little less worried about that. Another good thing is that the Americans so dominate the tech space compared to our allies. And that means that the asymmetry in American influence coming out of this crisis vis-a-vis Japan, Canada, Europe is going to be in our favor. The Americans are actually going to have more influence over our allies, and the dollar as the global reserve currency will be stronger because the digital economy is so advantaged. That will also lead to a bigger fight with the Chinese because the only competitor with the US on big tech is actually not an ally, it's China. And that's a worry. The concern inside the United States on the tech companies being so strong is that many of these companies are monopolies. They're anti-competitive. And it's not clear that they support civil society. It's certainly not clear that they help protect individual privacy and civil liberties. And the willingness to further erode that, because we will need some form of surveillance and geo-tracing around people that do and do not have antibodies, people that have and have not gotten the vaccine, people that do and do not have symptoms for coronavirus for the next 2-3 years. We're going to rely on these tech companies actually a lot more than we are right now under quarantine, because that's how we get back to work. And so when we're fighting a war, and the coronavirus is a war, we got to beat them. That means that everything else kind of takes the back seat. It's like the war on terror, 9/11. We had to make sure that there was never going to be another terrorist attack like that in the United States. Well, you remember privacy took a pretty big hit after 9/11. Individual liberties took a big hit after 9/11. It was really hard to criticize that because we were all in it together. And I think that there's going to be some of that right now with the tech companies. And potentially you'll see a real erosion of the fabric of civil society in democracies as a consequence of that.
It's 2020, and 2020 means election time, and we start to see the deterioration of what was bipartisan a couple months ago already.
Yeah.
Would the world be very different under a President Trump or a President Biden?
I mean, it would be different. I think it would be less different than is broadly appreciated. Let me give you an example. So everyone's asking me now about the US-China relationship. And of course, it's mostly through the Western lens. It's through Trump's tweets, it's through his press conferences, the announcements he makes. But if you ask me, who's had more of an impact in changing the US-China relationship, Trump or Xi Jinping? It's not even close. I mean, Xi Jinping, anti-corruption campaign, Belt and Road, AI dominance by 2025, they say, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, end of term limits for Chinese leadership, on and on and on. I mean, that is a dramatic shift in the entire Chinese system, where Trump, I mean, he talks a lot and he alienates some people and he's got his America First platform, but actually, you know, most of the policies that you've seen under Trump are not that different. I mean, I would argue it was a bad thing that he pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. That would have helped us with the Chinese. But Obama, it was Obama's policy and he couldn't get it done. So it's not clear to me, even if Trump had wanted TPP, if he could have done it. I mean, it's at least it's an open question. So, you know, I think that this idea that Biden becomes president and suddenly the United States moves in a completely different direction, US presidents are constrained by their own administration, by the deep bureaucracy of the US, you know, lots and lots of civil sector workers who don't make a lot of money, but are pretty patriotic, think they're doing a good job, and basically, you know, want to work in a certain way, and they'll stop you from doing stuff and slow roll it or whistle blow if they don't like what you're saying. A robust partisan media on both sides of the aisle, separation of powers with the legislature, an independent judiciary. You remember Trump's first executive order, I'm going to do a Muslim ban, shot down left and right, right? I mean, all of these things that he wants to do that are challenging to actually implement. I mean, I think that Biden, clearly, he would get us back in the Paris climate deal. Clearly. He'd get us back in the intermediate nuclear arms agreement, nuclear forces agreement with the Russians, blue skies with the Russians. Yeah, these things at the margins absolutely matter. And I think that he would regularize diplomacy, create a lot more normalized touch points, particularly with allies who are used to working in a certain way. And that's not as much about policy, it is about process. But the process would probably be more robust under Biden. But looking at the world and the world economy and the growth of inequality and the move away from the US-led global order and all these other things we're talking about, actually the American presidential election has less impact on that than so many other structural features and characteristics of the way the world is going.
You know, and as a leader in political risk in the world, and thinking about it, creating conversations about it, I've always wanted to ask you what the change you want to see in the world is. You report on what is, as you say, the now, but is there a change in the world that you hope that comes out of the pandemic and the crisis we're in?
The change that I would hope to see would be that this crisis is big enough for some governments around the world and non-government actors, whether it's CEOs of big companies or Bill Gates or Antonio Guterres at the UN, I'd like to see them start to try to use that crisis to address some of the institutions that used to work well and now don't anymore. And they don't, not because the leaders are evil, they don't, not because the institutions were created badly, but rather when you create institutions, they usually reflect the values, the sensibilities, and the political balance of the time. And what happens is, you always, when you create institutions, you don't want them to be weak, you want them to be strong, because you don't want a new leader to come in and break it. So you make it hard to change, which is great in the short term, but in the long term, that means that as the order of power in the world shifts, the institutions suddenly become less aligned. And that's not only true with an organization like NATO, which is still oriented towards Russia and conventional weapons and nukes. And clearly, if we were creating a new security alliance today, we'd focus more on Asia and China and tech and cyber and the economy. So we wouldn't recreate NATO, we would do something else. But we have NATO. But it's not just that, it's also capitalism. I mean, the rules of capitalism and the social safety net and contract that we created were created at a time when people had full-time work for a long period of time with a company that they got a lot of their benefits from. And today, increasingly, full-time work is much more gigified. And it's not clear that we have constructive things for full-time employment to do. And we'd want to measure it differently. And we would clearly, if we were creating capitalism today, and if we were creating a social safety net from scratch today, it would look different because the economy is different. One thing I want to give Trump credit for is breaking NAFTA. I like NAFTA when we created it. But, when Trump became president, NAFTA only covered less than 50% of the total trade between US, Canada, and Mexico. And that's because today, a lot of the trade between the US, Canada, and Mexico is about data and services, which were not relevant when we created NAFTA. So you actually needed to break that institution and modernize it, have it reflect today. Now, that was fairly easy for Trump to do. Number one, because he was an outsider who was oriented to say all deals before him were bad, only his deals were good. And number two, because Mexico and Canada are they're not very powerful compared to the US, and they rely on us completely. So if we tell them to do something, they do it. But it's a really good example of what I would like to see come out of this crisis is more thinking like that. And not just because the institutions are bad, because they don't reflect me, because they're broken, but rather that the world has changed. This crisis shows us the world has changed. And so we need to take some risks with some of this architecture. Gary, the worst thing in the world, you said, how do I want a world to change? If we go to 2030 and NATO still exists in the same form that it does today, we failed. We failed because it means that institution isn't serving us anymore. And I think that that's true of a lot of things out there right now. And this is the crisis that affords us the opportunity, the kick in the ass, to make us do some of this stuff.
A couple quick questions as we close in that we ask most leaders. I'm dying to know, what are you reading? I'm
reading right now an awful lot of work from key journalists around the world. I think it's very important that you're not just monitoring the US and the UK. I mean, when I was a kid, I loved reading The Economist in high school. I thought that was what you needed to read to understand the world. If you're just reading from a Western perspective, you're really missing what's going on in big parts of the world that are going to decide the future. So I try to read a lot more of some of the, the lead thinkers and policy influencers, the public intellectuals from China, from Russia, from Turkey, from Brazil, and, even places like Germany and Japan that are allied with us that feel differently, because I think that really helps push us in ways that otherwise we wouldn't be pushed. I also have recently I've gotten out some of my old Ian Banks, who passed away a couple of years ago, but I always thought was one of the most insightful, big structural thinkers about the future and how societies work. It's interesting. He's the guy that Elon Musk names a bunch of his rockets after the ships that you find in the Ian Banks novels. Musk is a strange character in many ways, but on this one, I kind of like him.
It's great. 2 leaders, living or dead, who most influenced your thinking or you most admire?
That I most admire. Let's talk about living, because they're here right now.
Sure.
I love Angela Merkel because here is a woman that has learned from her mistakes. 6 months ago, she was absolutely facing an end to her legacy. She said, we're going to take 1 million refugees from Syria. Horrible backlash. Popularity down the drain. Says it's the end of her rule. She tries to get Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer to become her successor. Fails. I mean, we were going to look at one of the most powerful leaders of the last decades in Europe become a footnote. And she ends up becoming the most powerful, the most successful Western leader in responding to coronavirus. No nonsense, no cheerleading, relentless work, getting it done, using that to help make Europe stronger, to try to create resilience for the countries that can't make it in Europe, the Southern, the East European countries under trouble. And she's going to be able to name whatever leader she wants as her successor. She's got 80% approval ratings right now. So I give her a lot of credit. And the other one, Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand. It's easy to run New Zealand. You got like 5 million people. You got more sheep than that. You're completely isolated from everybody. Everyone wants to go to your country. They shoot Lord of the Rings there, for Christ's sake. Who wouldn't want to be there? But she's managed to make a name for herself globally by simply saying what's on her mind and doing what's right. Whether it's a response to a horrible terrorist attack, the largest mass murder by a long margin ever on New Zealand territory, to the fact that she was able to completely not just flatten, but destroy the curve with coronavirus. And, it's not running laps around everybody. It's not browbeating or breastbeating. It's just getting it done. And, I really like leaders that focus on science, that try to get the best talent in the world around them. They're not scared by having people smarter than they are, because it makes them look better and more capable, not weaker. That's the kind of leadership that we like and that we need. And there are people like that around the world today, but by themselves, of course, and with the architecture we have, it's not enough to bring the world together.
Ian, if a millennial leader, Gen Z leader comes up to you and says, can I have one piece of advice? One thing you might tell me that might shorten my trails to become a better leader in the future, what would you tell me?
Yeah, and I'm not sure you're going to like it. It's the fact that understanding how to get to gatekeepers, decision makers, is not to be undervalued and is completely underappreciated. It's exactly the opposite of what you usually hear at a commencement speech. Dream big, work hard, become an expert, develop a niche. All of this stuff. And those things are important. Don't get me wrong. They're very important. I don't think you get anywhere if you don't have those things. But they've kind of heard that message over and over. I think that because you always want to give the idealistic message to young people, sometimes you forget about the secret that's under the rug. And the secret under the rug, which existed when I was a kid, and I had to learn it the hard way, as a kid that grew up in the projects, and my dad died when I was 4, and my mom didn't finish high school, and I didn't have a network, is that unless you figure out, you actually deconstruct the system and figure out how to get to the people that make the decisions of whether or not you get an opportunity, you're going nowhere. And as hard as that was for me, with inequality the way it is today, it is so much harder for young people today. And I fear that they don't hear that message. I fear people don't tell them that enough. And so as a consequence, they end up not valuing as much as they should the dirty work of learning about how a system really operates and what it takes to get access to the people that are going to determine their future.
Ian, thank you. Thank you for taking your time. Thank you for challenging our thinking. Thank you for challenging our conversations that we need to have to learn faster in the future. I really appreciate your time. And I'd also like to thank the Washington Speakers Bureau for bringing us together and enabling this conversation. Hope to see you again soon, Ian.
Thanks, Gary. Love you guys. WSB, we've been working together for years and years now, and Godspeed in this challenging environment, but we will get through it.